one world system outlined in Revelation, certainly Revelation 13, a system whose stage is being set today for a world of tomorrow. And that globalist empire will be ruled by the Antichrist, a tyrannical leader that the Bible calls the beast and the man of sin or lawlessness. In the meantime, the globalists are stirring things up, preparing the way for the coming one world system. They do that through war, through pandemics, through meddling within nations to destabilize many of them, through the, I call it the crazy green agenda. And another topic I want to hit this particular hour with my guest, who I'm bringing on in just a few seconds here, would be the fact that the FBI has been suggesting that you may be anti-government, you may be an extremist if you've purchased a Bible, if you shopped at Dick's Sporting Goods or Bass Pro Shops, if you use the term MAGA or Trump. So what kind of an invasion of privacy is this that we're going to be talking about? Because it's on everyone's mind, particularly those who are analyzing our times. One who has documented this for over 30 years is Gary Kah. He joins me today to look at the rush to one worldism. He was also a speaker at 2 of my annual conferences here in the Twin Cities, and he is an author. We'll say more about that in a moment. But in the meantime, Gary, welcome back to Understanding the Times.
Hi, Jan. It's a pleasure to be with you.
As Dr. Heinsohn said in that opening clip, people will give up rights to gain some things, and eventually society will even, as you know, give up cash for digitized system of money. People will trade convenience for security. And this is not the beginning. This has been going on for 30 years or more, as you have documented, correct?
That's right. I first learned about it in the early to mid-1980s when I was traveling overseas doing work with our embassies and international trade promotion, and I was surprised at that time how many of the people I met held a globalist worldview. It seemed to me like some of them in the State Department already back then would have been more loyal to an empowered UN than to the United States, and that threw up some major flags because, as you know, with my background, my father at age 12 fled from the communists, and at age 13 fled from the Nazis. My mother grew up under Hitler in Germany with family that was very much opposed to Hitler, so they had their share of stories that they went through. And I grew up hearing about all this, being born over here, but at family gatherings, seeing what my family went through, and then now all of a sudden I'm in this government position, and I'm hearing talk from these people who are essentially globalists, and the one thing that they held in common was that they were not very fond of Bible-believing Christians, nor politically conservative Jews or Christians or Israel, and that threw up more flags. Again, this was in the 1980s, and that's what first prompted me to begin researching these matters, and then eventually I was, and this had to be the Lord, I was invited to join 2 different organizations that were actually part of this globalist agenda, and through that was able to get an inside look, and that led to the writing of my book, En Route to Global Occupation, which came out in early 1992.
So who is speeding all of this up? Which organizations? Could you name half a dozen of them?
Back in the day, I became familiar with organizations, of course, like the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Club of Rome, the Bilderberg Group. All that was well underway already in the 1980s. But a short time later, the World Economic Forum began coming on the scene, at first in a small way, but a lot of these organizations and groups that I just mentioned seemed to feed into that organization. And under Klaus Schwab's leadership and people like Bill Gates and other very wealthy individuals, George Soros, feeding into it, it's become quite a powerful organization. So they have really rallied around the UN, seeking UN empowerment. You have Secretary General of the United Nations, Guterres, who, as the former president of Portugal, also, during part of that time, was the leader of the Socialist International. And if people haven't heard of that organization, that is the mothership of practically all socialist/communist groups in the world. He was the head of that, and now he's the head of the United Nations. And most people have no clue. They don't realize that, how radical of an organization that is. And then there's Ghebreyesus, who's the head of the World Health Organization,
right.
And he was an Ethiopian socialist revolutionary leader. So his reward was being made head of the World Health Organization. You've got people who are staunch globalists slash Marxists in some cases who are now heading up the UN. You've got the World Economic Forum and other groups that feed into them, completely propping up the UN, trying to give that organization more and more power. And then you also have Pope Francis, who through his group, Guardians of the Council for Inclusive Capitalism, you're looking at over $30 trillion that can be moved around fairly quickly just through that organization. And they also feed into the World Economic Forum. Those Guardians, by the way, the Pope put Lady Lynn Forrester de Rothschild in charge of that group. So you've got some of the big banking families tied into this as well, who've been in it for a long, long time, like the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers in this country, and so on. And then I have to mention King Charles. Whether people realize it or not, he's become viewed as the de facto leader of the global environmental movement. And it goes all the way back to 1992 and the Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit that pretty much kicked off what I call the hyper global environmental movement that also pushes for global government. And so he's part of this and was a keynote speaker recently at a meeting in the Middle East. And just a couple of others I'd mention, investment groups like BlackRock, Vanguard, and others. People give and trust these organizations with their money because they know how to make money. Pretty much by now have all the bases covered. And the problem, Jan, is these people are now the ones in control. And it's much more difficult to get them out of control once they're in.
Well, Gary, I want to go down a pathway because you opened the doors, and that's the World Economic Forum, because they just met in January in Davos, their 54th annual meeting. The theme was rebuilding trust. I think they feel they blew it in the previous year, probably the previous 3 years, because of a certain health crisis that came on the scene. They welcomed over 100 governments this year at the 54th annual meeting, all major international organizations. They had civil society leaders, youth representatives, social entrepreneurs, news outlets. But I think one of the biggest takeaways for me, and I'm going to play this very short clip of Yuval Noah Harari talking about the one person that's standing in the way of their plans would be Donald Trump, and he's very open about this.
Are you concerned that Trump might be elected again shortly?
I think it's very likely. And if it happens, it is likely to be the kind of like the death blow to what remains of the global order. And he says it openly. Now again, it should be clear that many of these politicians, they present a false dichotomy, a false binary vision of the world, as if you have to choose between patriotism and globalism, between being loyal to your nation and being loyal to some kind of, global government or whatever.
Gary, that was just a month ago in Davos. Again, that was Yuval Noah Harari, an Israeli. He's a thinker, commentator. He's part of the World Economic Forum leadership. I think what astounds me is they're so blatant, they're so upfront. Look, the man who's standing in the way of our agenda is Donald J. Trump. Now, making this comment is not a political statement by you or me. It's just a fact. This is the way they're thinking.
Yes, getting national sovereignty away from the countries of the world, that has been their biggest task in order to have a new global society, a world government organization, and a global economy as part of that world government. So here in the United States, you have a people who have been fiercely independent because our ancestors, for the most part, came to the United States to get away from kings and autocrats and tyrants telling them what to do. So getting the U.S. on board, they thought they could do that by putting the UN on U.S. soil, whereas the League of Nations was in Geneva. And that helped their cause some, but people have become more and more skeptical, seeing that the UN's interests most of the time are not those interests of the U.S. They don't have our best interests in mind. They simply don't. So this is all about power and how to consolidate that power globally. And they see Trump as standing in the way in the U.S. because he's been very outspoken against globalization.
Yes, he has. Very outspoken. It troubles me because, and again, not a political statement here, but even Alex Soros came out a week or 10 days ago and suggesting, quite bluntly, assassination. So when we start talking up front about using those kinds of terms in public, I get quite shocked. I really do.
Yeah, they want to make the world more and more interdependent, so they cannot have an independent U.S. And the first thing Trump would do if he's reelected is the energy, the oil would flow again within the U.S. We have enough oil for the next 50 years or more, and that would run our economy and make us less dependent on the rest of the world, and they cannot have that. So that's just part of it. And, of course, the border crisis, that's very intentional. If people haven't figured that out by now, this is just one other way that they're trying to bring down the United States and destroy us from within so that we're easy prey for a takeover.
So they promoted the idea of a polycrisis, claiming that the world is now contending with multiple crises. Again, pandemics, climate crisis, multiple wars. I might go there in a moment here. Economic turndowns. The World Economic Forum is warning that even as we turn our attention to new crises, the old ones persist. That's their words. Now, Gary, they're talking about a coming pandemic that is 20 times more deadly.
My first question when I listen to that, and I've heard that numerous times in the last few weeks, that this thing is going to be 20 times deadlier. How do they already know that? Unless there's something already in the offing that they're waiting for the right moment to spring on us. I know that sounds very conspiratorial, but how do they know that this thing is going to be 20 times deadlier? So they're already in advance trying to scare people to death and set the stage so that the World Health Organization will be able to move in and commandeer everyone in a way even more so than they attempted to do last time. There's so much to be said here, I don't even know where to begin. I know that your listeners are probably familiar with the push for a World Pandemic Treaty.
Yes.
Well, it's going to be the 77th World Health Assembly, and that is the lead part of the World Health Organization. And they're going to be convening at the end of May for the specific purpose of ratifying their global pandemic treaty. I found out just recently this has been in the making for at least 3 years, since March of 2021, that we know about, and maybe even before then. So the purpose of this is to give them special powers the next time a pandemic hits, and they'll be able to move much more quickly, shut things down more quickly, have more authority and power, and I believe ultimately use it in the name of health and prevention of spreading this virus. They will argue in favor of probably a personal QR code. That'll be part of one's digital ID. They'll say money is dirty. We need to do away with cash because it can spread the virus. Same thing with credit cards. So I think that's going to be part of this as well. There's the financial side. Ultimately, people have to understand it's all about control. So being aware of the globalist endgame in all of this, namely the implementation of a global governing system to control us, it seems to me that the powers that be will attempt to launch major crises, plural, on several fronts to facilitate this push into their new world order. Another health crisis alone, I don't believe will be enough this time, especially in the U.S., where people have been awakened to these tactics. I'm wondering, in fact, I wrote in an article recently, how would Americans respond to a triple play? What if a pandemic lockdown, an economic collapse or crisis of some type, and a crippling attack from Russia or Iran's proxies in our country were all to occur at the same time, in addition to all of the proposed draconian impositions related to climate change? And this, unfortunately, is not an unrealistic scenario given the current trajectory of our nation's policies through the deep state in Washington.
You're absolutely right. Gary, I just want to go back to that conference coming up again in May, the World Health Assembly. That would be May 27th to June 1st, the spring. By the way, Michelle Bachmann was in attendance at the one in 2023. And again, Mr. Biden calls this an accord, so he can wield his powers and his executive orders and doesn't have to answer to Congress if it's called an accord. Again, it's planning for future pandemics and clamping down on them. The 77th World Health Assembly coming up this spring that Gary's referring to. It's in my notes that I wanted to, what's there? Perhaps guns and weaponry. Purchase tickets to travel by bus, cars, or plane, all of the above. And the article goes on to say, in fact, if you selected any of those options in recent years, you're already on a government watch list. That's how broadly the government net is being cast in its pursuit of domestic extremists. We're all fair game now, easy targets for inclusion on some FBI watch list or another. Again, that's a partial article by John Whitehead on WND.com. Gary, your thoughts on this? This just blows me away because purchasing a Bible will now get us in trouble.
Well, information is power, and if you want to control people, knowing everything about them and where they stand, it makes sense that these organizations who are now run more or less by globalists, unfortunately, including some of our intelligence organizations, they want to know who the conservative Bible-believing Christians are, those who would oppose a new world order that is very anti-Christian. Obviously, we don't want to see a world system come about that would persecute us and Jews and our independence as nations and try to take that away from us. Smart people who are in a battle, they size up their adversaries and want to know everything about them, and that's what they're doing as globalists right now. They want to know who has purchased what from these various stores, like Dick's Sporting Goods, who went out and bought a gun in the months that followed January 6th or before even. And a lot of this began years ago, Jan. It's just we're more aware of it now, but this has gradually been coming on for decades. And our FBI used to be a solid organization. They were held in high esteem for being excellent crime fighters, and there are still a lot of good people in that organization, but increasingly people who are loyal to a globalist anti-U.S. agenda have risen through the ranks up to the top of that organization, and they surround the current president now. So Biden, even if he wanted to take a different path, other forces are leading the way. He's pretty much having to do what they say, or else he'd be out of there, because he's so blackmailable and corrupted, they could get rid of him very quickly if they wanted to, and he knows that. So he's doing their bidding and moving forward with an agenda that a few decades ago he may not have supported, but right now he doesn't have much of a choice. So that's unfortunately where our nation is at. So the last thing that these people want is for Trump to come into power and turn their agenda upside down.
You're listening to Understanding the Times Radio. You can learn much more about Gary's outreach, books, etc. GaryKah.org. When I come back, here's where I want to go for part 2 of my programming. What about this COP28 and forthcoming COP29? Whoever would have thought that the climate agenda would become front and center of the new global spotlight of the One Worlders, focusing on the green agenda? Why? Why is that their obsession? I also want to talk about, for a minute or two anyway, the Summit of the Future coming up in September of 2024. My guess says this may be the most important global gathering to date. What about the World Government Summit coming up in February in Dubai, United Arab Emirates? See, they don't get any more obvious, frank, and blunt than they just call these summits the World Government Summit, because their plan, the One Worlders, is global government. One way or another, by hook or by crook, they are planning on a world with a single ruler. They just don't know it's going to be an ignominious 7 years where everything's going to fall apart, and that would be followed by Jesus' second coming and the establishment of the true New World Order, the millennial reign of Jesus Christ on earth for 1,000 literal years. I believe, my guest believes as well. I'm back in just a minute or two. Don't go away.
Globalism is a word that's on everybody's lips these days. Years ago, you almost never heard the term, but today it's a household word, that we're a global community, a world village, that we all need to interconnect with one another. In fact, it's the reality of our times. Back in 1973, I was flying on a Delta jet. I pulled the Delta Sky magazine out of the rack, and I was reading an article about the coming cashless society of the future, way back then. It said the day will come that cash will almost be meaningless to people. Everybody will use a credit card. Some kind of cashless wireless transactions will be taking place. Money will be moved from one account to another automatically. This is going to be the wave of the future. Now, they made it sound like it was all going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years, but in the next 30 or 40 years, it became a reality. We are living in a day and age unlike anything the world has ever seen before. And all of that change causes a lot of concern and a lot of questions, because the Bible clearly predicts the fact that in the end times, a sinister figure, the Antichrist, will control a global economy. Now, in commenting on this, in my book, Antichrist Rising, I make this statement on page 105, and I want to read it to you right out of the book. There's certainly nothing morally wrong with computers or televisions or satellites or cashless financial transactions. but many Christians are concerned where all of this might lead. It appears that we are slowly becoming the victims of our own technological advancements. We're being swept down the corridor of time to an ominous date with destiny, steadily moving toward the inevitable globalization of our planet as national identities and interests continue to be submerged by the global worldview. Today, the attitude of the world is we're only concerned about what's good for the rest of the world. We really don't care about you.
Welcome back to Understanding the Times Radio. Talking for the hour with Gary Kah. I'll get back to Gary in just 1 minute. Just want to say that I actually have a DVD I made some 3 years ago, Hidden in Plain View, The New World Order in Bible Prophecy. It's in my online store, olivetreeviews.org, olivetreeviews.org. I look at the topic for over an hour that we're talking about on air today. Try to cite the organizations and individuals going back many hundreds of years, actually, who put it all into motion. Again, you can find Gary's books at garykah.org. Quick heads up that our winter magazine is out. You might want to sign up for both our e-newsletter, which is about once a month, sometimes twice, or the print magazine. Go to olivetreeviews.org and go to newsletters. Check out our prayer wall where you can post prayer requests and actually see people responding to them. And again, if you are on YouTube, be careful. Hundreds of our videos stolen, altered. So look for subscribers. Currently, 205,000 subscribers. Any other channel on YouTube is stolen, it's hijacked, it's altered. It is trying to create chaos. Now, let me move on quickly, by the way. Check out Gary's magazine. It's quarterly. Hope for the World, garykah.org. Gary, quickly here, I want to hit a few more things as time allows. Whoever would have thought, when looking at globalism, did you ever expect that climate would be front and center for these people? Again, we've had COP28 the month of December, COP standing for Conference of Parties, COP29 coming up end of year. King Charles, seen as the leader of this, as you referenced. When was he anointed for this?
To answer your first question, I have been aware since the 1980s that the environment and climate would be center stage in this agenda toward globalization. It was in the mid-80s that I was invited to join the World Constitution and Parliament Association, pushing in favor of a world government. And at that time, they put out for their members a list of 49 reasons for why we need a world government. And almost a third of them had to do with the environment. So we knew it was coming, but it was in 1992 with the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro that all this was really launched in more of a public way. Some of the key figures involved in that were Stephen Rockefeller, Maurice Strong, Mikhail Gorbachev, Prince Charles at that time, Al Gore to some degree. And that's when it began to gain traction. In fact, an Earth Charter was drafted, and then you saw more and more the media picking up on this and beginning to warn people about the impending doom with the environment unless something is done. And then over the last 10 years, it's just taken off exponentially. And the thinking behind this is, okay, if we can make the environment appear to be a global problem, global problems demand global solutions, right? If it transcends national boundaries, and so that plays right into the UN power grab. The UN needs more power and authority to deal with the issue of the environment. It was global warming. Now it's climate change because some parts of the world are getting colder and others are warmer, so they have to just keep people engaged in all of this. Ultimately, they want to dictate to us how much energy we use, when and where we use it, where we live, how we heat our houses, pretty much everything, because energy runs our lives. And again, that's why they want the U.S. to be interdependent and not independent for our energy resources, because that's a big part of this climate agenda.
And what I'm impressed by, and not in a good way, are the number of very important people who have signed on to it, as you've already indicated, starting with King Charles, Pope Francis. Of course, I call him the vicar of the New World Order. We've got, as you've referenced, the Rockefellers, and you referenced in one of your messages, even National Education Association, all religious leaders from every denomination, including Gary Kah. Evangelicals have signed on to the Green Agenda.
Yeah, you've got Pope Francis, who a couple of years ago launched his global compact on education, which deals heavily with this issue of the environment and climate change and really a socialist agenda. So the problem you have there is it doesn't stop with the Pope, because the World Council of Churches and the denominations represented through that organization, which, by the way, over the years has gotten a lot of its funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, they're all too happy to jump in and support this agenda. So you've got the leaders now of many of our mainline denominations front and center and promoting all of this. And to go back to the World Constitution and Parliament Association for a moment, back in the 80s when I was familiar with that group, Cynthia Waddell, who was the former president of the World Council of Churches, was an actual member who funneled into that organization that was just blatantly globalist. So again, this has been around for many years, just now it's more and more public, and these people realize that they can go public because they have so much support out there. We've got our 35 and under young people who are 70% or more globalists and socialists now in their political leanings. So if you're going to implement an agenda, at some point you have to go public with it. You can't keep it private forever, and that's what we're seeing now. They feel very confident and cocky. They believe they can pull this off, and they just need a few crises to help them accomplish their goals.
It has turned into earth worship in some places, I think in part, including at these COP meetings, Conference of Parties, COP28 coming up, COP29 end of this year. Worship the creation rather than the creator. And a lot of this began, I think, 1970 was the first Earth Day. Obviously, this was all in the planning well before 1970, but then it's blossomed, and as you say, in the last 10 years, absolutely exploded, simply off the chart. Gary, another crisis that they're trying to suggest, in fact, is a crisis, and I hate to say it, we have got the threat of World War III on our doorstep. Just a quick clip here, very short, Dr. Mark Hitchcock addressing this, because we have potentially, it's starting in the Middle East, we've got one in Ukraine, we've got the potential between China and Taiwan.
On today's program, I want to talk about wars and rumors of wars, what Jesus predicted over 2,000 years ago. Jesus, in his final great sermon there on the Mount of Olives, overlooking the Temple Mount area in the city of Jerusalem, he gave a litany of signs that will portend his coming. And in Matthew chapter 24, verse 6 and 7, Jesus said, "You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars, for nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom." And today we see exactly what Jesus predicted 2,000 years ago in Matthew 24. There are more and more wars and conflicts erupting everywhere and every day. And there's all kinds of rumors of wars or talks or threats of war across the world today. And that's what we want to talk about. I don't believe we're in a world war right now, but I believe our world is at war. And that's a great sign, I believe, that the coming of Christ is near.
Gary, but the point is, I think, is that this is something that the one-worlders will use as the crisis that has to be controlled, preferably by a one-world government system.
I believe their agenda to bring it in, they're going to need, as I mentioned earlier, multiple crises, financial, pandemic, but I believe to put it over the top, it will at the very least require the threat of a world war or possibly an actual world war, because people have to be so terrified and scared to death that they're willing to surrender many of their freedoms in order to march into this new world order, which will promise world peace. So when you look at the world right now, you've got the simmering Ukraine-Russia war, and you've got an expanding war in the Middle East. If Israel gets attacked by Hezbollah in a major way, we need to be watching that, because that would change everything, because Hezbollah is being supplied by Iran through Syria. So to stop the flow of weapons to Hezbollah, Israel would have to take some kind of action on Syria. And at that point, things would really get serious, because you've got Russian advisors in there. I learned through my best contact in Jerusalem, who has been dead on repeatedly. He's got 2 sons in the IDF. A few weeks ago, 10 Iranian generals took up positions in Syria. They're there calling the shots pretty much. So if Israel is forced to have to deal with Syria directly, then all of this expands, and you could literally have the Ukraine-Russia war and the war currently limited to Israel and Hamas expand into one massive world war, and then who knows what happens from there. So we're keeping a close eye on that. But if the globalists want it, it's so easy for them to stir things up. It's much more difficult to keep the peace, but it's very easy to get a crisis going in the Middle East, especially with all the terror groups and cells that globalists have inroads with. I'm expecting this. I want to be wrong. Believe me, I know you do as well, but I see things drifting toward a global war, possibly even yet this year. We'll have to wait and see. And I do want to comment quickly while I think of it on a timetable. I was on another talk show a little bit less than 2 years ago, and afterwards a listener called in to the host and said, I've got to talk to Gary. Can you please put us in touch with each other? It's extremely important. That took place. I ended up talking to this individual for about an hour, and he became involved in the One World movement through the back door, through the environment, because of a legitimate environmental concern he had on his property, and it brought him into the global environmental movement, and he didn't realize it. It was basically part and parcel with the globalist movement, and he ended up being mentored over time by a very prominent figure within the World Economic Forum. Just before I was on this program, he had lunch with this individual. And by the way, this new friend of mine, he's on our side, but he has stayed in these circles just to gather information. So he asked his contact, his so-called mentor, as quickly as things are moving along, do you believe that the Great Reset could still lunge forward and move forward quickly this year? And he barely got the question out of his mouth, and the guy said, 2024, 2024, just emphatically. So this gentleman wanted to tell me that at that time, about 2 years ago, they were specifically targeting 2024 to just shake things loose in a major way. Now, a lot can happen in 2 years. I don't believe in setting dates. I believe that's the quickest way to lose credibility. But it is helpful to know what our adversaries have been planning.